Have you ever felt like the world conspired against you? That no matter how hard you try, there's always someone ready to tear you down the moment you need an opportunity most? This is the story of a man who discovered the hard way that sometimes those who should support us are the first to abandon us when we make a mistake. David Parker was a talented software engineer, dedicated father, and respected professional, until the day a single slip-up cost his employer millions and turned his life into a living hell of public humiliation and systematic rejection. What followed were 3 years of doors slammed in his face, judgmental stares, and the constant feeling of carrying an invisible mark that screamed failure to everyone who knew him. Imagine waking up every day knowing your reputation was destroyed by someone who should have been your leader, but who chose to make you a public example of incompetence. Thomas Bradley didn't just fire David, he humiliated him in front of the entire team, turning a technical error into a professional execution that would echo for years. While David struggled to rebuild his career, Bradley continued climbing the corporate ladder, using the story of the irresponsible developer as an example of his firm leadership. It was like watching your tormentor prosper while you withered in the shadows, carrying the weight of an injustice that no one seemed willing to question. For 3 long years, David faced rejection after rejection, each job interview becoming a torture session where he had to explain and re-explain the same mistake, like a criminal being forced to repeatedly confess his crime. His wife Jennifer watched in silence as the man she loved transformed into a shadow of himself, and his daughter Emma began asking questions he didn't know how to answer. The bank account dwindled, opportunities disappeared, and David began to believe that maybe he really was the failure everyone said he was. Until that day came, the day he was literally ready to give up everything and accept that his career was over forever. That's when Marcus Chen from TechVision asked a question that would change everything. A question so unexpected, so different from everything David had heard in the past 3 years, that for a moment he thought he had misheard, but there was no mistake. And the answer David gave in that moment would not only save his career, but trigger a series of events that would transform his greatest humiliation into the sweetest revenge. What happened next was so surprising that even David couldn't have predicted it, and the final twist would leave even Thomas Bradley speechless. You know that feeling of being at rock bottom, looking up and seeing only darkness? That's exactly how David Parker felt on that freezing January morning in Denver. At 38, he carried the weight of 8 months without work, like a stone in his chest that grew heavier each day. Bills piled up on the kitchen table like soldiers in formation, ready to attack what remained of his dignity. Jennifer, his wife, tried to keep a smile on her face, but David saw the fear in her eyes, that silent fear of someone who doesn't know how they'll pay next month's rent. Emma, his 15-year-old daughter, had stopped asking for money to hang out with friends, and that hurt more than any bill collector's call. The guy who was once considered one of the best software engineers in the region now felt like a ghost wandering through the halls of his own home. Every morning was a battle against the voice in his head whispering, "You're worthless." And the worst part? He was starting to believe that damn voice. The house that used to be his refuge now felt like a prison where every room screamed his failures. The office where he used to work late into the night had become a storage room for bitter memories. Jennifer had suggested turning it into the sewing room she'd always wanted, but David knew it was just a gentle way of erasing the traces of who he used to be. The silence of a phone that didn't ring with job offers was deafening. Each passing day, hope slipped away like sand through his fingers. He was drowning, and with every attempt to swim to the surface, the waters seemed deeper. The downfall in David's life had begun 3 years ago, when a single mistake cost a financial institution millions. Since then, his career had plummeted like a plane without fuel, leaving a trail of wreckage in its wake. Job interviews became psychological torture sessions where he had to repeatedly explain that episode that became his deepest scar. "Tell us about your experience at Pinnacle Bank," interviewers would say, and David felt his stomach churn as if he'd swallowed broken glass. The humiliation of being publicly fired still echoed in his mind like a scratched record, insisting on playing the same sad song. He had become the guy who broke the bank in the industry, a label that stuck to him like gum on a shoe. No matter how much he tried to reinvent himself, create a new narrative, the past always showed up in reference checks. It was like carrying an invisible cross that only he could feel the weight of, while everyone around pretended not to see his agony. Jennifer always said things would get better, that it was just a matter of time, but David saw the worry growing in her eyes with each "no" he received. Friends in the field started avoiding him, as if failure were contagious. Social media became minefields where former colleagues posted their promotions and achievements. He had become a pariah in his own profession, a living reminder of how everything can crumble in seconds. Recovery seemed like a word from another language, something he had once known but completely forgotten how to pronounce. On that specific morning, while shaving in the fogged bathroom mirror, David made a decision that would change everything. "This is the last one," he murmured to himself, observing the gray hairs that seemed to have appeared overnight like unwanted visitors. TechVision Solutions would be his final attempt before accepting that his career had reached its end, like a train derailing in slow motion. Maybe it was time to consider that warehouse job his brother-in-law had mentioned. It wasn't exactly software engineering, but at least it would pay the bills and restore some of his dignity. Pride? Well, pride doesn't pay rent, doesn't put food on the table, doesn't buy school supplies for Emma. He put on his best suit, the one Jennifer had ironed so carefully the night before, whispering words of encouragement that sounded more like prayers. The suit was getting too loose. Stress had stolen not only his sleep but also a few pounds and his former confidence. In the mirror, he saw a tired, defeated man, but one who still had one last breath to give, like a boxer in the final round. "Give it everything, David," he said to himself, without much conviction, but with all the determination he could muster. It was now or never, the last card before accepting that maybe he was no longer the man he once was. The scar of failure pulsed like phantom pain, reminding him that some wounds never completely heal, but maybe, just maybe, it was possible to transform that pain into fuel for one last attempt at recovery. The drive to the TechVision Solutions building felt like a walk to the gallows, each mile weighing like a ton. David drove his 2010 Honda Civic through Denver's streets, watching people hurrying along the sidewalks, each with their own problems and dreams. Had any of them ever felt this emptiness in their chest? This feeling of floating in space, without gravity, without direction, without purpose? The radio played a cheerful song that cruelly contrasted with his state of mind, like a bad joke from the universe. He turned off the sound and continued in silence, only with the engine noise and his own thoughts hammering in his head. At every red light, the temptation to turn around and go home grew like a wave about to break. What difference does it make, he thought, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. It'll just be another polite rejection, another "we'll keep your resume on file." But something, maybe it was stubbornness, maybe desperation, maybe love for his family, kept him driving toward what could be his last chance. The GPS indicated only 5 minutes left, but it felt like an eternity until the moment of truth. He thought of Jennifer making coffee at home, probably praying that this time would be different. Emma was still sleeping, dreaming of a future where her father would return to being the hero she always thought he was. The responsibility weighed on his shoulders like a lead cape, but also propelled him forward. The TechVision Solutions building rose before him like a monument to the success he had lost, a cathedral of the corporate world, glass and steel gleaming under the weak winter sun, full of important people doing important things, living lives that seemed to have meaning. David parked the car and spent a few minutes watching employees coming and going, all with that confidence he had lost along the way. They seemed sure of where they were going, what they were doing, as if they had a life map that he had misplaced. He, on the other hand, felt like an imposter about to enter a club he no longer belonged to, an actor without a script trying to improvise. "Courage, David," he whispered, adjusting the tie Jennifer had chosen. The navy blue one she said highlighted his eyes and made him look trustworthy. He thought of her and Emma, waiting at home, rooting for him, even without knowing if there was still hope or if it was just another desperate attempt. This wasn't just a job interview. It was his last card before accepting that maybe he was no longer the man he once was. The January cold cut like a blade, but the cold in his chest was even more intense. Each step toward the main entrance was an act of faith, a bet against all odds. The humiliation of another rejection seemed inevitable, but the microscopic possibility of a turnaround kept him walking. Entering the elegant lobby, David felt the weight of stairs, or at least imagined he felt them, as if everyone knew his story. The receptionist, a young blonde named Ashley, greeted him with a professional smile that seemed rehearsed but genuinely warm. "David Parker for an interview with Mr. Marcus Chen," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt, like an actor playing a better version of himself. While waiting on the leather sofa that probably cost more than his car, he observed the other candidates. They all seemed younger, sharper, more relevant. One was typing furiously on a laptop. Another was leafing through an impressive portfolio full of achievements David could only dream of. David looked at his own hands, calloused from years of typing code, and wondered if they still knew how to work magic on the keyboard, or if they had forgotten the tricks. The emotional scar of past failure pulsed like phantom pain that insisted on reminding him of its presence. He had reached rock bottom, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a hidden ladder somewhere in the shadows. What he didn't know was that this interview was about to reveal that sometimes rock bottom is just the starting point for something much bigger. The magazines on the coffee table talked about innovation and success, words that seemed from another planet. Each minute of waiting was a small torture, but also an opportunity to mentally prepare for what was coming. Recovery seemed like an impossible mountain to climb, but he was there, at the foot of the mountain, ready to try once more. The waiting room felt like a courtroom where David was simultaneously defendant and judge of himself, weighing evidence of failure against glimpses of hope. Each passing minute was an eternity of questioning. Why am I still trying? Why don't I accept that it's over and move on to something else? But then he thought of Emma, asking if they could go to the movies on the weekend, with those bright eyes full of expectation. He thought of Jennifer pretending she didn't mind using discount coupons at the supermarket, cutting expenses without complaining. They deserved more than this, deserved the David he used to be, confident, competent, capable of solving any code problem that came his way. Maybe this was his chance to find that man lost in the ruins of his career, like an archaeologist searching for treasures in the past. Or maybe it was just another humiliation to add to the collection that was already getting too heavy to carry. Either way, he was there, on the edge between giving up and hope, balancing on a tightrope over the abyss. The magazine he was flipping through talked about professional reinvention. What cruel irony of fate. Each page seemed to mock his situation, showing success stories that seemed like science fiction compared to his reality. But something inside him, a stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished, whispered that maybe there was still a chance. The scar of the past hurt, but scars are also signs that we survived something that could have destroyed us. And when Ashley finally said, "Mr. Parker, Mr. Chen is ready to see you," David stood up knowing that the next few minutes would define not only his professional future, but his very identity. The hallway to Marcus Chen's office seemed to stretch infinitely, each step echoing like a countdown to a decisive moment. David adjusted the folder with his resume, a document that seemed more like a confession of crimes than a list of professional achievements. His palms were sweating as if he were about to give a presentation to 1,000 people, and he discreetly dried them on his suit pants. "Be yourself," Jennifer had said the night before, kissing his forehead with that tenderness that reminded him why it was worth fighting. But which version of himself should he be? The brilliant engineer he once was, or the broken man he had become after the fall? Maybe the answer lay somewhere between these two versions, in a third person he didn't know yet, but was about to discover. The smell of fresh coffee came from somewhere in the office, mixed with the aroma of ambition and opportunity that permeated the air. Each door he passed represented lives and careers in motion, people making a difference while he struggled just to survive. The humiliation of being there, begging for a chance, burned like acid, but necessity was greater than pride. When he finally reached the office door, David took a deep breath, filling his lungs with all the courage he could gather. On the other side of that door was his last chance at recovery or his final defeat. He turned the handle knowing he was about to cross a line. Forward or backward, he still didn't know, but there was no turning back now. Marcus Chen wasn't what David expected to find on the other side of that imposing door. In his early 40s, TechVision's CTO had a genuine smile and relaxed posture that contrasted with the formal corporate environment. He gestured for David to sit in a comfortable armchair, not the hard chair that usually sat across the desk in interviews. "Want some coffee? Water? Something to relax?" Marcus asked, and David noticed it wasn't just courtesy. There was something sincere in that tone. The office was modern, but welcoming, with green plants in the corners and an incredible view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. David accepted the coffee, more to have something to do with his trembling hands than out of thirst. "You know, David," Marcus began, flipping through the resume, "I've read everything about you. I know about your experience. I know about the projects you've led. I also know about what happened at Pinnacle Bank." David's heart raced like a broken engine. There it was, the moment of humiliation he so feared. But Marcus continued, "And that's exactly why you're here." David blinked, confused. Had he misunderstood? The emotional scar he carried began to pulse, preparing for another session of pain. But there was something different in Marcus's look, something David couldn't decipher yet. It was as if he was seeing David through a completely different lens than he was used to. "Let me ask you a question," Marcus said, leaning forward with genuine interest shining in his eyes. "David, tell me about the biggest technical mistake you've ever made and how it shaped who you are today as a professional." The question hit David like lightning in a clear sky, making his world stop for a few eternal seconds. It was the question he most feared, but formulated in a way he had never heard before. It wasn't, "Explain your failure," or "Why should we trust you after what happened?" It was something completely different, a question that suggested the mistake could have value, that pain could have purpose. David felt his throat dry as if he had swallowed sand. His hands began to sweat again, and he gripped the coffee cup as if it were an anchor in the storm. For a moment he considered giving a diplomatic answer, something rehearsed that would minimize the impact, but something in Marcus's look made him stop. There was genuine curiosity there, not the judgment he was used to facing. It was as if Marcus really wanted to understand, not just judge. David took a deep breath, feeling he was about to open a wound he had tried to keep closed for 3 long years. The turnaround in his life was about to be revisited, but this time perhaps with a different purpose. Maybe this was the chance to transform his greatest shame into something useful. 3 years ago, David began, his voice trembling slightly like a poorly tuned violin string. I introduced a bug into Pinnacle Bank's transaction system. The words came out like forced confessions, each syllable carrying the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. It wasn't a simple error. It was a logic flaw that allowed duplicate transactions during a high-demand period. In 6 hours, before we could identify and fix the problem, the bank had lost $2.3 million. Marcus didn't interrupt, just nodded, encouraging him to continue. The worst part wasn't even the money. David continued, feeling the emotional scar opening like a fresh wound. It was the public humiliation. My boss, Thomas Bradley, fired me in front of the entire team, saying I was an unacceptable risk to any financial institution. The memory came back with full force. The pitying faces of colleagues, the embarrassing silence, the walk of shame to the exit. Since then, I've carried this mark like a scar that everyone can see, even when they don't talk about it. David paused, expecting to see the same judgmental look he had grown accustomed to finding. But Marcus continued, just listening, as if each word were an important piece of a puzzle. But you know what I learned? David continued, surprising himself with the courage. I learned that a $2 million mistake teaches you things that no course or certification can teach. Continue, Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that made David realize this wasn't an ordinary interview. It was almost like a confession, a moment of truth that rarely happens in corporate environments. I learned to question every line of code as if someone's life depended on it, David continued, feeling a strange liberation in speaking openly about his greatest shame. I learned to implement triple verification systems to create emergency protocols that most developers don't even consider necessary. He paused, taking a sip of coffee that was already getting cold. I learned that recovery doesn't come from avoiding mistakes, but from becoming someone capable of dealing with the consequences when they inevitably happen. Marcus nodded slowly, as if each word confirmed something he already suspected. I learned humility in a way that no success could have taught me. I learned that my value as a professional isn't in never failing, but in how I get up after the fall. David realized he was speaking with a passion he hadn't felt in years, as if he were rediscovering who he really was beneath all that shame. And I learned that sometimes the greatest job of your life comes disguised as the greatest humiliation. The words came out before he could censor them, and for a moment David wondered if he had said too much, if he had exposed himself beyond what was necessary. But Marcus was smiling, not a smile of pity or condescension, but something that seemed admiration. David, Marcus said, putting the resume aside as if it were irrelevant. That's exactly the answer I hoped to hear. David's world stopped again, but this time for a completely different reason. You know why you're here? It's not despite what happened at Pinnacle Bank, it's exactly because of it. David felt like he was hearing in a foreign language, the words reaching him but taking time to make sense. TechVision is facing a situation that requires someone who has already been through fire and come out the other side stronger. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking at the city below. I need someone who understands the real weight of technical decisions, someone who has already paid the highest possible price for a mistake and learned to live with the consequences. David felt his heart beating so hard, he was sure Marcus could hear it. Most of the developers I interview have never really failed. They have perfect resumes, impeccable references, but they've never been tested by fire. Marcus turned to David with an intense look. You were tested and survived. That's worth more than any certification or award I could see on a resume. David felt something strange happening in his chest. Could it be hope? After so long carrying his scar as a mark of shame, someone finally saw it as a badge of honor. The conversation had taken a turn that David could never have imagined when he entered that room. Marcus wasn't just offering a job. He was offering a chance to transform his greatest shame into his greatest strength. What do you mean? David asked, his voice coming out hoarser than normal. Marcus returned to his chair, but this time there was an urgency in his movements that wasn't there before. David, TechVision is facing a security crisis that could destroy our reputation and cost our clients millions. The words echoed in the room like an echo from David's past. We need someone who not only understands the technical aspects but comprehends the human and financial ramifications of every decision. David felt the irony of the situation like a punch to the stomach. Are you offering me the chance to fix the kind of problem I caused? Marcus smiled, but it was a tense smile, loaded with responsibility. I'm offering the chance to use your unique experience to prevent others from going through what you went through. David's emotional scar pulsed, but this time it wasn't just pain. It was recognition. Maybe his journey of humiliation and recovery had been preparation for this moment. But I need to know, Marcus continued, are you ready to face this kind of pressure again? Because if we hire you, it won't be for just any position. It'll be to lead the solution to a crisis that could define the company's future. The silence that followed was loaded with possibilities and fears in equal measure. David could feel the weight of the moment, as if his entire life had conspired to bring him to this specific conversation. "Marcus," he finally said, "for 3 years I've carried my mistake like a cross. Every interview, every rejection, every judgmental look reminded me that I was the guy who broke a bank." He paused, organizing thoughts that had been scrambled for so long. But maybe that mistake wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was just the most painful chapter before the restart. Marcus nodded, clearly impressed with the maturity of the response. "I'm ready," David continued, feeling a strength he didn't know he still possessed. "I'm ready to use everything I learned, all the pain I felt, all the humiliation I carried, to ensure no one else goes through this." It was as if he were hearing himself speak for the first time in years, rediscovering his own voice beneath all that fear and shame. "Because in the end," he said, looking directly into Marcus's eyes, "who better to prevent a disaster than someone who has already lived through one?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with promise and possibility. David knew his life was about to take a completely new direction, but he still didn't imagine that the most dramatic turnaround was yet to come. Marcus extended his hand with a smile that mixed relief and determination. "Welcome to TechVision, David. You start Monday." David shook the hand, feeling like he was waking up from a 3-year nightmare. "But," Marcus continued, and there was something in his voice that made David pay full attention, "I need to warn you about something that might complicate things." David's stomach contracted slightly. The client facing the security vulnerability, well, it's a financial institution you know very well. David felt his blood freeze in his veins. "Don't tell me it's—" Marcus nodded gravely. "Pinnacle Bank, and the IT director responsible for the project is still Thomas Bradley." David's world stopped completely. The irony was so cruel, it bordered on impossible. "Are you telling me my first job here is to save the same bank I broke, working with the man who publicly humiliated me?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious but understanding. "David, I know it's a lot to ask. I know it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done, but I also believe it could be the most important." David looked out the window, seeing the city stretch to the horizon, and realized that fate had prepared for him not just a second chance, but the chance to face his demons head-on. The real turnaround of his story was just beginning. Monday arrived like a hurricane disguised as an ordinary morning. David woke up before the alarm, his stomach churning as if he'd swallowed a running washing machine. Jennifer had prepared his favorite coffee, and Emma left a good luck note in his briefcase, but nothing could calm the storm forming in his chest. While getting ready, David looked in the mirror and saw a man about to face the greatest challenge of his professional life. This wasn't just a new job. It was a chance at redemption wrapped in an impossible situation. How could he explain to his family that his first day of work would literally be fixing the mess he'd made years ago? "Everything will be fine," Jennifer said, adjusting his tie with that tenderness that always calmed him. But David knew this time was different. It wasn't just about getting a job. It was about facing the ghost that had haunted him for 3 years. The emotional scar pulsed like an open wound, reminding him of every detail of that terrible day at Pinnacle Bank. He kissed his wife and daughter, carrying with him not only their hope, but the weight of a second chance that could also be his last. The drive to TechVision felt like a walk to the courthouse where he would be judged not only as a professional, but as a man. The recovery he had sought for so long was there, within reach, but disguised as the greatest test he could imagine. Upon arriving at TechVision, David was greeted by Marcus, who took him directly to a conference room where a team of 6 developers was waiting for him. The introductions were cordial, but David could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. "Everyone," Marcus said, "this is David Parker, our new technical lead for the Pinnacle project." Eyes met, and David saw a mixture of curiosity and skepticism on the faces around the table. Sarah Williams, a senior developer with red hair, was the first to speak. "I heard about your previous experience with Pinnacle. Must be interesting to work with them again." The tone wasn't hostile, but there was a hint of irony that David couldn't ignore. Jake Morrison, a young programmer who couldn't be more than 25, whispered something to the colleague beside him that David couldn't hear, but he could imagine the content. "Look," David said, deciding to face the situation head-on. "I know you must be wondering why they hired the guy who caused a $2 million problem at Pinnacle. I wonder about that too." An uncomfortable silence took over the room. "But I'm here because Marcus believes my experience, including my mistakes, can help solve this crisis." David looked at each team member. "I don't expect you to trust me immediately. I hope to earn that trust by showing I've learned from my mistakes." The humiliation of having to justify himself again burned, but he knew it was necessary. This team would be his only chance at success or failure. Marcus activated the projector, and the screen lit up with complex diagrams of Pinnacle Bank's system. "The situation is critical," Pinnacle, he began, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who knows time is running out. We've discovered a vulnerability in the authentication system that allows unauthorized access to high-value accounts. If exploited, it could result in losses of up to $50 million. David felt his blood freeze. It was like reliving his worst nightmare, but amplified. The problem is that the vulnerability is deeply integrated into the code base they've developed over the past 3 years, Marcus continued. Any poorly executed fix could bring down the entire system. Sarah raised her hand. What's the timeline? Marcus looked directly at David before answering. 3 weeks. Pinnacle found evidence that hackers have already identified the flaw and are planning a coordinated attack. The weight of responsibility fell on David like an avalanche. 3 weeks to save the same bank he had harmed. 3 weeks to prove that his recovery wasn't just a nice story, but a tangible reality. And there's one more thing, Marcus said, hesitating. Thomas Bradley insisted on personally supervising the project. He'll be present at all progress meetings. David closed his eyes for a second, feeling as if the universe was testing how far he could go. The turnaround in his life had taken on a dimension he could never have predicted. The first week was a deep dive into the most complex code David had ever seen. Pinnacle's system had evolved significantly since his time there, becoming an intricate network of microservices and APIs that communicated in a dangerous digital dance. Every line of code he analyzed was like exploring a minefield, where one wrong step could cause an explosion even bigger than his previous error. Jake and Sarah worked alongside him, initially reluctant but gradually impressed by David's meticulousness. Dude, Jake said one afternoon, you really analyze every function like you're defusing a bomb. David smiled bitterly. That's because that's exactly what I'm doing. The emotional scar from the past made him question every decision 3 times before implementing any change. It was exhausting, but it was also what set him apart from other developers. While they saw code, he saw consequences. While they thought about functionality, he thought about lives that could be affected. The humiliation of the past had transformed into a hypersensitivity that, ironically, made him better at what he did. But the pressure was constant, like an invisible hand squeezing his chest. Each night he returned home exhausted, carrying not only the fatigue of work, but the weight of knowing that millions of dollars and his own redemption depended on every line of code he wrote. Jennifer noticed the tension, but David couldn't explain the magnitude of what he was facing. In the second week, Thomas Bradley appeared for his first supervision visit. David saw him through the conference room glass before he even entered, and his stomach churned as if he'd swallowed acid. Thomas was exactly as David remembered, tall, imposing, with that look that could make anyone feel small. When he entered the room, the silence was deafening. David Parker, Thomas said, his voice loaded with a coldness that cut like ice. I can't say I expected to see you again, especially not in this context. David stood up, extending his hand in a show of professionalism that cost all his willpower. Thomas, thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the solution. The handshake was too firm, a subtle demonstration of power that David understood perfectly. Let's see if you've learned anything since last time, Thomas said, sitting at the head of the table like a judge about to pass sentence. The meeting that followed was a session of psychological torture disguised as a technical review. Thomas questioned every decision, every line of code, every security protocol David had implemented. Are you sure this approach won't cause side effects? Thomas asked, irony dripping from every word. David responded with the patience of a saint, explaining every detail, every precaution, every test he had performed. But inside, he felt like he was being slowly torn apart. The humiliation of the past resurfaced with full force, but this time he had a team watching, judging whether he could maintain his composure. It was a trial by fire that would determine not only the project's success, but his capacity for recovery. The pressure reached its peak in the third week when evidence of invasion attempts began appearing in the system logs. They're probing, Sarah said, pointing to suspicious access patterns, testing the limits of the vulnerability. David felt like he was in a race against time where every second could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Nights became early mornings, and early mornings became mornings without him leaving the office. Jennifer called worried. Emma sent messages asking if he was okay, but David could barely respond. He was completely immersed in a battle that was simultaneously technical and personal. Every line of code he wrote was a small victory against the ghost of his past. Every successful test was a step toward the redemption he had sought for 3 years, but fatigue was taking its toll. His hands shook when he typed, his eyes burned from staring at the screen so much, and his mind began playing cruel tricks, making him question decisions he had made with certainty hours before. David, Marcus said one morning, you need to rest. You won't be able to save anything if you collapse. But David knew he couldn't stop. Not when he was so close to proving that his scar could become his greatest strength. The turnaround of his life depended on the next few days, and he was determined not to waste this chance, even if it cost everything he had. The final days before implementing the fix were the most tense of David's professional life. The vulnerability vulnerability had been identified and corrected, but now came the most dangerous part, implementing the solution in a system that processed millions of transactions daily. It was like performing open-heart surgery on an awake patient. Thomas Bradley had increased the frequency of his visits, appearing almost daily to monitor progress. Each appearance was like receiving an injection of anxiety directly into his veins. "I hope you've tested this exhaustively," he would say, looking over David's shoulder while he worked. "We can't afford another incident." The word incident was pronounced with a venom that made David shrink internally, but he had learned to channel this humiliation into fuel for his determination. Every sarcastic comment from Thomas only made him work harder, check more times, test more scenarios. The team began to see David in a new light. Jake commented to Sarah, "The guy is obsessed with perfection. I've never seen anyone test a solution so much." And Sarah replied, "Maybe that's exactly what we need. Someone who understands what can go wrong." David heard these conversations and felt a mixture of pride and melancholy. His technical paranoia, born from the pain of failure, was becoming his greatest professional quality. The emotional scar he carried was finally serving a purpose greater than his own pain. But the final test still remained, the actual implementation, where they would discover if all this preparation would be enough to avoid a catastrophe even greater than the previous one. Implementation day arrived like a final judgment that David had postponed for 3 years. TechVision's control room was filled with monitors showing Pinnacle Bank's system status in real time, each graph and metric representing millions of dollars and the reputation of hundreds of people. David looked at the screens and felt like he was watching the heart of a financial giant beating on his monitors. Thomas Bradley had arrived early, bringing with him 2 other Pinnacle executives David didn't know, but whose looks carried the weight of those who had much to lose. "So, Parker," Thomas said, adjusting his tie with that arrogance David remembered well. "Today we find out if you really learned something or if we're going to relive the old days." The room fell into an embarrassing silence, as if everyone knew they were about to witness a confrontation that went far beyond technical issues. Marcus tried to intervene. "Thomas, I think we can keep the focus on," but Thomas raised his hand, interrupting with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "No, Marcus, I think it's important that everyone here understands what's at stake. David already cost my bank $2 million once. Today he has the chance to cost us $50 million if something goes wrong." David felt each word like a stab, but forced himself to maintain the composure he had learned to cultivate during years of humiliation. Public humiliation was happening again, but this time he had a team that had learned to respect him by watching his every move. Sarah and Jake exchanged uncomfortable looks, clearly bothered by Thomas's unnecessary cruelty. David's emotional scar pulsed like an open wound, but he took a deep breath and said, "Thomas, I understand your concern. That's exactly why we spent 3 weeks testing every aspect of this solution." It was the first round of a battle that would define not only the project's success, but David's very soul as a professional. "Testing," Thomas laughed with disdain, the sound echoing through the room like a rabid dog's bark. "Like you tested last time?" The venom in his voice was palpable, and David felt his blood boil like lava in his veins. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened that completely changed the room's dynamics. Jake, the young developer who had initially doubted David, stood up with a determination that surprised everyone. "With all due respect, Mr. Bradley," he said, his voice trembling slightly but firm as rock, "David is the most meticulous professional I've ever seen work. He verified this solution in ways I didn't even know existed." Sarah nodded vigorously, her eyes shining with a loyalty David never expected to inspire. "He taught us security protocols we didn't learn in college. If anyone can fix this without causing damage, it's him." David felt a wave of gratitude that almost made him cry, as if years of professional loneliness were being washed away by this unexpected show of support. For the first time in 3 years, people were publicly defending his work, putting their own reputations at risk to protect him. Thomas seemed surprised by the team's reaction, like a school bully who suddenly realizes his victim has friends. But he quickly recovered his arrogant posture, adjusting his suit like it was armor. "How touching," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But feelings don't pay for damages. Let's see if all this confidence is justified." Marcus positioned himself beside David, a silent but powerful demonstration of where his loyalty lay. "Thomas, let's begin. David, you have our complete confidence." But David knew that his team's confidence, however valuable, wouldn't be enough if something went wrong. The turnaround of his life depended on the next few minutes, and Thomas Bradley was there to ensure that every second was calculated psychological torture. It was as if fate had orchestrated the perfect confrontation between past and future, between humiliation and redemption, between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. The recovery David sought was literally a few clicks away, but the path path there led directly through the man who had destroyed his career once. You know, David said, turning to face Thomas directly, for 3 years, I wondered if you were right about me, if I really was an unacceptable risk. Thomas smiled with satisfaction, thinking he had managed to shake David again. But now I understand that's the wrong question. The right question is, why do you feel the need to humiliate people who make mistakes instead of helping them learn? Thomas's smile disappeared like smoke in the wind. Because a real leader builds his team, doesn't destroy it. The room was so quiet that David could hear his own heartbeat. And maybe, just maybe, if you had been that kind of leader 3 years ago, that mistake would never have become a disaster. Thomas turned red, his hands clenching into fists. Are you blaming me for your mistake? David shook his head slowly. No, I'm saying that your reaction to my mistake taught me more about leadership than you ever intended. It was time to implement the solution and discover if all this emotional and technical preparation would be enough for the redemption he sought. David positioned himself in front of the main computer, his hands trembling slightly over the keyboard, like those of a pianist before a decisive concert. Every key he pressed echoed in the silent room like cannon shots, reverberating with the weight of 3 years of preparation for this moment. Initiating complete system backup, he announced, his voice firmer than he felt, like an actor who perfectly masters his role even with his heart racing. The next 20 minutes were an eternity of tension, while terabytes of data were copied to secure servers, each byte representing the financial lives of thousands of people. Thomas paced around the room like a hungry predator, occasionally stopping to make comments that seemed calculated to shake David's confidence like drops of acid on an open wound. Interesting approach, he would say, looking over David's shoulder with that cruel smile that had haunted his nightmares. I hope it's more effective than your last strategy. David forced himself to ignore the provocations, concentrating on the protocols he had developed with the meticulousness of a surgeon preparing a life-or-death operation. Every step of the implementation had been planned and tested dozens of times, but Thomas's presence transformed every action into a trial by fire that tested not only his technical skills, but his emotional resistance. Backup completed, Sarah announced, monitoring auxiliary systems with the concentration of an air traffic controller. All data is secure. David nodded and moved to the next phase, feeling like he was walking on a tightrope over an abyss of possibilities. Initiating security fix implementation, he said, and began executing the scripts he had written so carefully, each line of code being like a silent prayer for redemption. The monitors showed a cascade of commands being executed, each line of code being processed by the system as if it were a recipe to save or destroy millions of dollars and an entire career. Thomas moved even closer, his breath almost on David's neck like a ghost from the past that refused to disappear. Are you absolutely certain this is going to work? Thomas asked, his voice low but loaded with threat, like the whisper of a snake about to strike. David stopped typing for a second, feeling the weight of 3 years of doubt and self-loathing pressing on his shoulders like a mountain. He turned to Thomas and said with a calm that surprised even himself, Thomas, I learned from my mistakes. The question is, did you learn from yours? The comment cut through the air like a sharp blade, and Thomas stepped back slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct response from someone he had spent years considering inferior. What do you mean by that? Thomas asked, his voice rising a tone like that of a child caught red-handed doing something wrong. David continued working, but spoke without taking his eyes off the screen, each word coming out with the precision of an experienced archer. I mean that a leader who publicly humiliates his team when they make mistakes isn't creating an environment where people feel safe to report problems. The room fell into absolute silence as if everyone was holding their breath to hear every word of this confrontation that had been 3 years in the making. If you had created a culture where I felt comfortable asking for help when I realized something was wrong, maybe that mistake would never have become a $2 million disaster. Thomas turned red as a ripe tomato, his hands trembling slightly with anger, or perhaps something resembling shame. Are you blaming me for your mistake? David finally stopped typing and turned completely to face Thomas, his eyes shining with a determination that had been forged in the fire of humiliation. I'm not blaming you for the mistake. I'm saying that your reaction to the mistake taught me more about leadership than any course I could have taken. The TechVision team watched the exchange with fascination and horror, like spectators at a duel that had been scheduled long ago. A real leader uses team mistakes as learning opportunities, not as excuses for public displays of power, David continued, each word coming out with the force of 3 years of reflection and personal growth. Marcus tried to intervene again, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that was building in the room like electricity before a storm. But David continued, his voice gaining strength like a river that finally finds its natural course. You fired me in front of the entire team not because it was necessary for the company, but because you wanted to show you were in control. Thomas was clearly furious, his face going through various shades of red like a broken traffic light, but before he could respond, an alarm sounded on the monitors like a banshee's scream. Invasion attempt detected, Jake shouted, pointing to one of the screens with the urgency of a soldier shouting about enemy fire. They're attacking now. During implementation, David felt his blood freeze in his veins as if he had plunged into a frozen lake. It was as if the universe had decided to test his recovery at the most critical moment possible, transforming what was already a tense situation into an epic battle between digital good and evil. The turnaround of his life was happening in real time, each second unfolding like frames from an action movie where the hero needs to save the world. He needed to prove that his scar had become his greatest strength, that all those years of pain and humiliation had been preparation for this unique moment. Fate had conspired to create the perfect test, implementing a critical security fix while hackers attacked the system, all under the judgmental gaze of the man who had destroyed his career. It was like fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously, but David knew he was ready. His entire journey of suffering and recovery had led to this moment of absolute truth. The cyber attack unfolding before them was like watching an epic battle in slow motion, each movement by the hackers being responded to by the reflexes David had developed during years of obsessive study. The invaders had chosen the moment of implementation to attack, betting that the system would be vulnerable during the transition, like predators attacking wounded prey. David saw access patterns he recognized immediately. They were the same techniques he had studied obsessively during his sleepless nights of preparation. Like a general who knows every enemy strategy, they're trying to exploit the old vulnerability while we implement the fix, he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard with precision that impressed even Thomas, like a virtuoso pianist executing an impossible piece. Jake, monitor incoming traffic. Sarah, keep backups ready for immediate restoration if necessary. The team moved like a well-oiled machine, each member executing their functions with the confidence David had built during 3 weeks of intensive preparation. Thomas watched in silence, his previous arrogance replaced by palpable tension that made his hands tremble slightly. David, Marcus said, his voice loaded with concern and hope in equal measure. Can you implement the fix while they're attacking? David didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning multiple screens simultaneously like a conductor directing a complex orchestra. Not only can I, he finally said, iron confidence tinting his voice, but this is exactly what I prepared for. He had anticipated this possibility, created specific protocols for implementation under attack, transforming his paranoia into preparation. It was as if all his painful experience had converged to this unique moment where every scar would become a tool of salvation. Thomas, David said without taking his eyes off the screens, you're about to see why hiring someone who has already failed might be the best decision you've made. Then while David worked implementing the security fix amid the cyber attack, something extraordinary happened that transformed the room into a theater of technological redemption. Every movement he made demonstrated a mastery that could only have come from someone who had paid the highest possible price for a mistake, like a warrior who becomes invincible after surviving his first defeat. He wasn't just fixing the vulnerability, but simultaneously blocking invasion attempts with technical elegance that left the entire room impressed, his fingers dancing over the keyboard like those of a virtuoso. He's doing this in real time, Jake whispered to Sarah, his voice full of admiration and disbelief. He's literally fighting hackers while fixing the system. Thomas, who had spent the morning trying to humiliate David, now watched in absolute silence like a fierce critic who suddenly finds himself before a masterpiece. It was impossible to deny the competence being witnessed, each line of code being executed with the precision of a surgeon saving a life. Fix implemented successfully, David announced, but continued typing with the determination of someone who knows the battle isn't over yet. Now let's show these hackers what happens when they try to invade a system protected by someone who has seen every possible nightmare. He activated counterattack protocols he had developed, not only blocking invasion attempts, but tracking their origins like a detective following digital clues. Sarah, are you seeing this? David pointed to one of the screens, his voice loaded with an irony that wasn't lost on anyone. They're using exactly the same type of exploit that caused my mistake 3 years ago. It's as if the universe conspired to give me a second chance to do the right thing. The irony of the situation was so perfect it seemed scripted. The man who had been fired for a security error was now saving the same bank from a much more sophisticated attack. Thomas Bradley watched in silence, and David could see something changing in his expression. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was just surprise, but it definitely wasn't disdain anymore. When the last hacker was blocked and Pinnacle Bank's system was completely secure, the room exploded in applause that echoed like thunder after a storm. Jake and Sarah hugged David with the enthusiasm of soldiers celebrating an impossible victory. Marcus smiled with paternal pride, and even the Pinnacle executives seemed relieved like survivors of a shipwreck. But David only looked at Thomas Bradley, waiting for his reaction like a gladiator awaiting the Emperor's verdict. The silence between them stretched for long seconds, loaded with 3 years of resentment, humiliation, and now, redemption that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. "David," Thomas finally said, his voice very different from the arrogant tone of hours before, sounding almost vulnerable. "I need to admit I was wrong about you." It was the first time in 3 years that David heard something resembling an apology from Thomas, and the words sounded like heavenly music in his ears. "You didn't just fix the vulnerability," Thomas continued, his words coming out with difficulty as if each syllable cost a piece of his pride. "But you did it in a way that demonstrates a level of competence I didn't recognize before." David felt the emotional scar he had carried for so long begin to truly heal, like an old wound finally finding peace. "Thomas," he said, his voice loaded with a maturity that had been forged in the fire of adversity, "I don't need your apologies. I just need you to recognize that mistakes don't define a person. How they respond to them does." Thomas nodded slowly, like a man who finally understands a lesson he should have learned long ago. "You're right, and your response today was exemplary." Marcus approached, placing his hand on David's shoulder with the satisfaction of someone who saw his bet become the play of the century. But David knew that more than a mission had been accomplished that day. His journey from humiliation to recovery was finally complete. At least that's what he thought in that moment of triumph, not imagining that the consequences of his redemption would be more complex than the original failure itself. In the days following the successful implementation, David discovered that solving the technical problem was just the beginning of a much more complex turnaround. News of what had happened at Pinnacle Bank spread through the tech industry like wildfire, and David Parker's name began circulating in corporate corridors again, but this time for completely different reasons. The guy who broke a bank saved the same bank, was how the story was being told, transforming David into a kind of urban legend of software engineering. But with fame came pressure he hadn't anticipated, like an actor who suddenly finds himself in the spotlight without asking for it. Companies began calling TechVision, offering million-dollar contracts specifically to have David working on their security projects. "We want the guy who already failed," executives said, in an irony that wasn't lost on David. His scar had become his trademark, his greatest shame transformed into his greatest commercial asset. Jennifer was thrilled with the opportunities that arose. Emma proudly told friends about her father who had saved a bank, but David felt a strange weight on his shoulders. The recovery he had sought for so long was happening more dramatically than he ever imagined, but it brought responsibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to assume. "You've become the poster boy for professional redemption," Marcus said in a private conversation, "but that means all eyes are on you now." David realized his journey back to the top was just beginning, and that success brought its own unique challenges. The turnaround he had experienced was just the first of many to come. The job that had saved his career now threatened to consume his identity in ways he had never imagined. The first unexpected consequence came from within TechVision itself, where David discovered that not everyone was happy with his sudden rise to corporate hero status. Robert Chen, a senior developer who had been hired 6 months before David, began making bitter comments about people who get promotions because of past mistakes. "It's interesting how failing spectacularly can be more profitable than doing the job right from the start," Robert said during a team meeting, his words dripping poison disguised as casual observation. David felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but this time accompanied by something new, the responsibility to defend not only himself, but the principle that people can change and grow. "Robert," David said, maintaining the calm he had learned to cultivate, "you're right that my mistake brought me here, but it was 3 years of hard work to overcome that mistake that allowed me to save Pinnacle." The tension in the room was palpable, like electricity before a storm. Sarah and Jake exchanged uncomfortable looks, clearly torn between loyalty to David and the desire to avoid conflict. Marcus intervened quickly, but the damage was done. David realized his redemption had created resentment in people who felt overshadowed by his dramatic story. It was as if he had traded one type of isolation for another, discovering that success could also be a form of loneliness. The emotional scar he thought was healed began to pulse again, reminding him that recovery is a continuous process, not a final destination. The job that had given him a second chance now became a battlefield where he had to constantly defend his legitimacy. Humiliation had changed form, but hadn't completely disappeared. The situation at home also began to complicate in ways David hadn't foreseen, like waves from an emotional tsunami that arrived long after the initial earthquake. Jennifer, who had been his rock during the difficult months, began showing signs of stress he initially initially couldn't understand. "You're different," she said one night while they dined in tense silence that contrasted with the celebrations of recent days. "Different how?" David asked, genuinely confused. "More distant, like you're constantly thinking about work." Jennifer sighed, playing with food on her plate like a reluctant child. "For months I rooted for you to get an opportunity, but now that you have it, I feel like I've lost you to it." David realized his obsession with proving his worth had become a habit he couldn't easily break, like an addiction to professional validation. Emma also noticed the change, commenting that her father talked about code even during dinner. The irony was cruel. He had fought so hard to recover his professional identity that he was losing his identity as husband and father. "I don't want you to go back to being the broken man you were," Jennifer said, her words carefully chosen, "but I also don't want you to become someone who only exists for work." David realized that true recovery wasn't just about professional success, but about finding balance between all parts of his life. The turnaround he had experienced at work needed to be accompanied by a turnaround at home, or he risked trading one type of failure for another. His professional scar was healing, but it was creating wounds in other aspects of his life he hadn't considered. Thomas Bradley, surprisingly, became an unexpected source of complications when he decided to make a public reparation for what had happened 3 years ago. During an industry conference, he told the complete story of David's mistake and how he had reacted inappropriately at the time, transforming what should have been an apology into another type of public humiliation. "I fired David Parker cruelly and unnecessarily," Thomas told an audience of hundreds of IT professionals, "and today I recognize that my reaction was more about my own fear of failure than about responsible leadership." David watched the video of the presentation at home, feeling a confused mixture of validation and embarrassment. On one hand, it was gratifying to see Thomas taking responsibility publicly. On the other, he felt like his private life was being transformed into corporate entertainment. "He's using your story to promote himself," Jennifer observed, watching the video over David's shoulder. "Look how he's positioning himself as the leader who learned from his mistakes." David realized she was right. Thomas had found a way to transform even his apology into a personal marketing opportunity. The situation became even more complex when other executives began inviting David to speak about professional recovery and learning from failure, as if he were a product to be sold. His scar had become a commodity, his pain transformed into motivational content. "I don't want to be the poster boy for failure that worked out," David told Marcus in a tense conversation. "I just want to do my job well." But Marcus explained that whether he wanted it or not, David had become a symbol, and symbols carry responsibilities that go beyond personal preferences. The job that had restored his dignity now threatened to transform him into a caricature of himself. The pressure of being an example of recovery began affecting David's own work in ways he hadn't anticipated, like an invisible weight that grew each day. Every project he took on was scrutinized not only for its technical quality, but as evidence that his redemption was real and lasting. "No pressure," Jake joked during a meeting, "but if you make another mistake, you'll destroy the inspirational narrative everyone's selling about you." It was a joke, but David felt the weight of truth behind it like a stone in his stomach. He began second-guessing every decision, checking and rechecking every line of code with an obsession that bordered on paranoia. "You're working with fear," Sarah observed during a code review session. "Before you were careful from experience, now you're being careful from terror." David realized she was right. The fear of failing again was becoming paralyzing, transforming his greatest strength into a potential weakness. The irony was bitter. He had overcome the trauma of the original failure only to develop the trauma of potentially failing again. Marcus noticed the change and called David for a private conversation. "You're sabotaging yourself," he said directly. "You're so worried about maintaining your redemption reputation that you're forgetting to be the exceptional professional who brought you here." David realized he had fallen into a psychological trap. He was trying to be perfect instead of excellent, and the difference was costing his peace of mind. True recovery, he realized, wasn't about never making mistakes again, but about having the confidence that he could handle them if they happened. His scar had become an obsession that threatened to create new wounds in his professional psyche. The job that should have been his salvation was becoming a new form of psychological prison. The most unexpected turnaround came when David received a call from a young developer named Alex Martinez, who had recently been fired after causing an error similar to what David had committed years ago. "I saw your story online," Alex said, his voice loaded with despair that David immediately recognized, "and I wondered if you could give me some advice." The conversation that followed was like looking in a mirror of the past, seeing his own pain reflected in another person's eyes. Alex told about sleepless nights, failed interviews, the feeling that his career had ended before it really began. "I feel like I have a mark on my forehead that everyone can see," Alex said, and David felt like he was hearing his own words from 3 years ago. "Everyone sees me as the guy who broke the company system, not as someone who can contribute." David realized he had found a greater purpose for his experience, not just as a personal recovery story, but as a way to help others going through the same hell he had crossed. "Alex," David said, his voice loaded with compassion that had been forged in pain, "you're not defined by your worst day. You're defined by how you respond to it." The conversation lasted 2 hours, and when it ended, David felt something he hadn't experienced since the beginning of his journey, the feeling that his pain had served a purpose greater than his own redemption. His scar wasn't just a mark of survival, but a tool to help others survive too. It was as if the universe had conspired to transform his greatest humiliation into the foundation for his greatest contribution to the world. The job that had saved his career now revealed itself as just the first step in a much larger journey of helping others find their own recovery. In the weeks following the conversation with Alex, David began receiving more calls from developers who had made significant mistakes and were struggling to rebuild their careers. Each conversation was like reliving his own journey, but this time from the side of offering hope instead of desperately seeking it. "You've become some kind of professional redemption guru," Jennifer joked, but there was pride in her voice that David hadn't heard in a long time. He realized he had found a way to transform his traumatic experience into something truly useful to the world. Marcus suggested that David consider writing a book or creating a formal mentorship program, but David hesitated. "I don't want this to become a circus," he said. "I want it to be genuine." The emotional scar he had carried for so long was finally serving a purpose greater than his own healing. He was helping others transform their own scars into sources of strength. "Maybe," David said to Jennifer one night, "all that pain was worth it if I can prevent others from going through the same suffering." Jennifer smiled, kissing his forehead with that tenderness that always calmed him. "You found your true calling," she said. "It's not just being a great developer, it's being someone who helps other developers become great too." David realized his recovery journey had transformed into a mission to help others on their own journeys. The job at TechVision had been just the beginning. His true career was just starting. The humiliation of the past had become the foundation for a future he could never have imagined when he was at rock bottom 3 years ago. 6 months after the Pinnacle Bank incident, David Parker was sitting in a TechVision conference room that had been transformed into an operations center for what Marcus Chen called Project Phoenix, an initiative to help technology professionals who had made significant mistakes rebuild their careers. The irony of the name wasn't lost on David. Like the mythological bird, he had risen from his own ashes, and now he was helping others do the same. The room was filled with resumes from developers, engineers, and analysts who had been marked by failures in their careers, each document representing a story of pain similar to what he had lived through. "We received over 200 applications this week," said Sarah, who had become the project coordinator, her voice loaded with admiration and concern in equal measure. David leafed through the resumes, seeing his own journey reflected in each story of failure and attempted recovery. There were developers who had caused data breaches, engineers whose code had brought down critical systems, analysts whose recommendations had cost companies millions. "Each one of them is me 3 years ago," David murmured, feeling the weight of responsibility he had taken on. The emotional scar he carried had transformed into a healing tool for others, but also into a responsibility that sometimes haunted him. Jennifer had joked that he had become the Dr. Phil of software engineering, but David knew it was more serious than that. Each person seeking help was placing their hope in him that it was possible to start over, that mistakes weren't professional death sentences. The job that had saved his career now expanded into a mission that went far beyond any corporate position he could have imagined. It was as if his entire journey of humiliation and recovery had been preparation for this moment of serving something greater than himself. The first major test of Project Phoenix came when Thomas Bradley personally called David, his voice carrying a humility that contrasted dramatically with the arrogance of previous years. "David," Thomas said, "I need your help with something delicate." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. The man who had publicly fired David was now asking for his assistance. "We have a young developer here at Pinnacle, Kevin Walsh, who made a mistake similar to yours from years ago. Not as financially costly, but equally devastating for him personally." David listened in silence, remembering how he felt when he was in Kevin's position. I reacted badly again," Thomas admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I yelled at him in front of the team, threatened to fire him, but then I remembered our conversation and realized I was repeating the same leadership mistakes." The revelation that Thomas was genuinely trying to change touched David in a way he didn't expect. "Would you like to talk to Kevin?" Thomas asked. "I think he needs to hear from someone who went through the same hell and came out the other side. David accepted immediately, realizing this was the perfect opportunity to test whether Project Phoenix could work in real situations. The turnaround in his relationship with Thomas was almost surreal. From antagonist to collaborator, from humiliator to humble, it was as if the universe was weaving together all the loose ends of his story into a redemption narrative that went beyond any script he could have imagined. The scar that Thomas had helped create would now become the tool to heal the wound he had opened in another person. The meeting with Kevin Walsh was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Pinnacle Bank itself, and David felt a strange mixture of nervousness and determination as he entered the building where it all began 3 years ago. The lobby looked exactly the same, but David felt like a completely different person walking through those familiar corridors. Kevin was a 26-year-old young man, disheveled hair and red eyes from someone who had spent sleepless nights, exactly as David remembered being after his own mistake. "Mr. Parker," Kevin said, his voice trembling slightly, "thank you for coming. I don't know what to do anymore." David saw in Kevin a perfect reflection of himself 3 years ago. The same hunched posture, the same lost look, the same feeling that the world had collapsed. "Kevin," David said, sitting beside him instead of across the table, "tell me what happened. No judgments, no fear, just the truth." The story Kevin told was painfully familiar. A configuration error that had caused system unavailability for 6 hours, resulting in productivity losses and customer frustration. "Everyone looks at me like I'm a virus," Kevin said, his words echoing exactly the feelings David had experienced. "Thomas yelled at me in front of the whole team, said I was incompetent." David felt a stab of anger hearing that Thomas had repeated the same behavior, but also realized this was his chance to break the cycle. "Kevin," he said, "you're not defined by your worst day. You're defined by how you respond to it." The next 2 hours were a professional therapy session disguised as a conversation between colleagues, where David shared not only his story, but the practical lessons he had learned about recovery, resilience, and professional growth. Thomas Bradley watched the conversation through the meeting room glass, and David could see something changing in the expression of the man who had been his greatest antagonist. When the session ended, Thomas entered the room with a posture David had never seen before, humble, almost reverent. "Kevin," Thomas said, his voice loaded with sincerity that surprised even David, "I need to apologize for my behavior. David taught me that leaders build their teams, they don't destroy them." Kevin looked confused between David and Thomas, clearly not understanding the dynamic that was unfolding. "You're not going to be fired," Thomas continued. "Actually, I want you to work directly with David on a special project we're developing." The proposal Thomas made was revolutionary. Pinnacle Bank wanted to become the first financial institution to implement a formal talent recovery program, an initiative to help employees who made significant mistakes recover and grow, instead of simply punishing or firing them. "We want you and David to lead this program," Thomas told Kevin. "You two understand better than anyone what it means to fail and recover." David felt like he was living in a parallel universe where everything that had gone wrong was being corrected more perfectly than he could ever have dreamed. The humiliation he had suffered in that same building was being transformed into an opportunity to create a system that would protect others from going through the same suffering. Kevin accepted the proposal with tears in his eyes, and David realized he had witnessed not only his own redemption, but the birth of a new form of corporate leadership. The scar that Thomas had helped create was being transformed into a tool for institutional healing. It was a turnaround so perfect it seemed scripted, but it was absolutely real. 6 months later, Pinnacle Bank's talent recovery program had become a model studied by companies across the country, and David found himself in a position he could never have imagined when he was at rock bottom. He had become a consultant specializing in career crisis management, helping not only individuals but entire organizations develop cultures that transformed mistakes into learning opportunities. "You created an entire industry," Marcus said in a conversation, clear admiration in his voice. "Companies are paying millions to learn how to transform failures into successes." David's office at TechVision had expanded to include a team of 5 consultants, all professionals who had gone through their own recovery journeys. Sarah had become his partner, specializing in technical aspects of career recovery, while Jake developed training programs for leaders on how to constructively handle team mistakes. "It's funny," David said to Jennifer one night. "I spent 3 years trying to hide my mistake, and now I make a living talking about it." Jennifer smiled, kissing his forehead with that affection that always calmed him. "You transformed your greatest weakness into your greatest strength," she said, "and you're helping others do the same." Emma, now 18 and preparing for college, had chosen to study organizational psychology, inspired by her father's journey. "I want to help people like you help," she said, and David felt a pride that went far beyond any professional achievement. The emotional scar he had carried for so long had not only healed, but had become the source of his greatest contribution to the world. The job that had saved his career had transformed into a vocation that was changing how the tech industry dealt with human failures. The true measure of David's success came when he received an invitation to speak at the same conference where Thomas Bradley had made his public reparation months before. But this time, David wasn't just an example of recovery. He was the keynote speaker, invited to talk about transforming scars into superpowers, a new approach to talent management. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had been publicly humiliated was now being publicly celebrated on the same stage. The lecture was a resounding success, with an audience of over 1,000 tech professionals who stood in ovation when David finished his presentation. "You don't hire people despite their mistakes," David said in his conclusion. "You hire them because of what those mistakes taught them." After the lecture, dozens of executives approached offering contracts and partnerships, but the most significant moment came when a young developer approached with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Parker," he said, "I made a terrible mistake at my company last week and thought my career was over. But hearing your story, I realize it might just be the beginning." David hugged the young man, remembering how he felt when Alex Martinez had called him months ago. "It's just the beginning," David confirmed, "and you're not alone on this journey." In that moment, David realized his transformation was complete. From victim to victor, from broken to builder, from humiliated to inspiring. The turnaround in his life hadn't just been about recovering his career, but about discovering his true purpose. His scar had become his signature, his trademark in a world that was finally learning that failures can be more valuable than successes. Thomas Bradley was in the audience that night, and after the lecture, he approached David with an expression that mixed pride and regret. "David," he said, "I need to thank you for teaching me what it really means to be a leader." It was surreal to hear these words from the man who had been his greatest antagonist. "You know," Thomas continued, "since we implemented the talent recovery program, our productivity increased 40% and our employee turnover dropped by half." David smiled, realizing that even the practical benefits of his approach were being validated. "But more important than that," Thomas said, "we created a culture where people aren't afraid to try new things because they know that if they make mistakes, they'll have support to learn and grow." It was exactly the kind of environment David would have liked to have had 3 years ago, and knowing he was helping create these spaces for others was more rewarding than any financial success. "Thomas," David said, "thank you for firing me that way 3 years ago." Thomas seemed shocked by the statement. "If you hadn't done that, I would never have learned what I learned, never would have developed the resilience I developed, and never would have found my true purpose." It was a statement David never thought he would make, but it was absolutely sincere. His humiliation had been the catalyst for his transformation, and he was genuinely grateful for it. "Sometimes," David said, "the worst things that happen to us are exactly what we need to become who we're really meant to be." Thomas nodded, clearly moved. "You transformed my greatest failure as a leader into my greatest lesson," he said, "and for that, I am eternally grateful." It was the perfect closure to a cycle that had begun with pain and ended with purpose. 1 year after the lecture, David was sitting in his new office, no longer at TechVision but at the headquarters of Phoenix Consulting, the company he had founded with Sarah and Jake to help organizations implement talent recovery programs. The walls were covered with thank you letters from professionals who had been helped by his programs, photos of teams that had transformed through his methodologies, and articles from trade magazines that called David the man who revolutionized corporate failure management. Jennifer entered the office carrying a cup of coffee and a smile that lit up the entire room. "Another letter arrived," she said, handing him an envelope that had been sent by a developer from Australia who had implemented David's techniques to recover from a mistake that had almost destroyed his career. "He says you saved not only his career but his life," Jennifer said, tears of pride shining in her eyes. David read the letter, feeling the same emotion he felt every time he received feedback from someone who had been helped by his work. "You know," he said to Jennifer, "I used to think my life was over when I made that mistake. Now I realize it was just beginning." Emma entered the office at that moment, now a brilliant college student who interned at her father's company during breaks. "Dad," she said, "I just finished reading the applications for this month's mentorship program. There are over 500 people asking for help." David smiled, realizing his small initiative had become a global movement. "Each one of these people is an opportunity to transform pain into purpose," he said, "and that's what gets me out of bed every morning." The emotional scar he had carried for so long had not only healed, it had become the source of his greatest joy and fulfillment. The job that had saved his career had transformed into a life mission that was impacting thousands of people around the world. His journey from humiliation to recovery was complete, but his mission to help others on their own journeys was just beginning. David Parker's journey teaches us one of the most powerful lessons about human nature, that our greatest failures can become our greatest triumphs, but only if we have the courage to transform pain into purpose. What began as devastating humiliation transformed into a personal revolution that not only saved a career, but created a movement that changed lives around the world. David discovered that his emotional scar wasn't a mark of shame, but a healing tool for others facing the same battles. His story proves that sometimes we need to be completely broken to discover what we're really made of. The most impressive thing about David's trajectory wasn't just his ability to recover, but his skill in transforming a traumatic experience into a life mission that benefited thousands of people. He could have chosen to hold grudges, seek personal revenge, or simply move forward forgetting the past. Instead, he channeled all his pain into a constructive force that revolutionized how the tech industry deals with human errors. His company, Phoenix Consulting, became a symbol that it's possible to rise from the most devastating ashes. The most surprising turnaround in this entire story was seeing Thomas Bradley, the man who had been David's greatest antagonist, transform into an ally and advocate of his methodology. This shows us that even people who hurt us deeply can change, grow, and become part of our healing. The reconciliation between David and Thomas wasn't just personal, but professional, resulting in programs that saved careers and transformed entire corporate cultures. It's proof that forgiveness can be more powerful than revenge. David's legacy goes far beyond his personal recovery. He created a new paradigm where failures are seen as growth opportunities, where mistakes become springboards for innovation, and where leaders learn to build instead of destroy. His story became inspiration for an entire generation of professionals facing their own moments of crisis, proving that no matter how deep the fall, it's always possible to find a way to rise again. David transformed his greatest weakness into his greatest strength and taught the world that scars can become superpowers. This story shows that sometimes our greatest defeats are just the prologue to our greatest victories, and that the true measure of a person isn't in never failing, but in how they get up after the fall. If this transformation journey touched your heart or made you rethink your own battles, share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to start over. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of recovery, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove it's never too late to rewrite your destiny. Sometimes, the right story arrives exactly when we need it most.